Hello and welcome to the Animorphs YouTube channel. Today we're going to start the review series for this channel. Firstly, apologies for my throat. I've recently done some fancy dress stuff and I used a different voice and it's cut me to shreds. So if I start coughing and spluttering or sounding really weird, you know it's why. But less of that, more about this book series. Animorphs has been probably my favourite book series since I was about 9-10 years old. It was this book, one of the first ones I owned, and for a while I never actually read it. I just had it because I liked the look of the cover. One of my trips to W.H. Smith for Waterstones, where my parents would get me a couple of books simply because I liked the cover of them, and I'd never actually read them because I'd find something else to do. But Animorphs was one of those books. Eventually, though, I did get round to reading it, and this was one of the first ones I read, which shouldn't seem surprising. It is the first book of the series, and a very important one for the series for the obvious reasons. Probably the most important. I mean, let's face it, you wouldn't be able to have any other books without this one, because it starts it all off. Everyone knows the story of this one. I'd say, if you had to get everyone, all the Animorphs fans together, this is the book that everyone would be most familiar with, I would suspect. It's the iconic one, where you probably have some of the most famous scenes from the series. It was done in the TV series, of course not as well. But we're going to run through the plot. There's going to be spoilers ahead, so if you don't know the series, go read the book yourself before you see this review. And I'm going to go over some of the points. What I did was I got a Microsoft Word thing out, and I went through the book, and every time I saw something I thought was noteworthy, I wrote it down. Things that perhaps I haven't seen in other reviews. I'm not going to just rehash something that someone else has done somewhere else. I'm going to look for the things that nobody else points out, or try to look a bit more in depth into the series. Make connections here or there where nobody's managed to meet them before. Being a writer myself, I love making little subtle connections here and there that don't stick out at first viewing. And that's the sort of thing I'm going to be looking for. And looking at the characters on a more personal level as they develop in the series. Not how they're written, but how things are implied with them, how they change through the course of it. So, number one, The Invasion, a very important book in the series with Jake morphing the lizard on the front. I am reading the old version, the old British version, so details may vary here or there, especially to the newer version that was released, which I haven't yet got. I'll probably do a video at some point in the future going over the changes there. But the plotline is effectively the same, pretty much. From the start, we have the Animorphs in the mall, and eventually they go off to the construction site where they meet the Andalite Prince Alfangor Cyrenial Shamtul. I'm assuming I'm getting his name right. I haven't actually made a note of it. I'm just going by memory. So I'm going to go through my list of points. Some of the more interesting things I found in the book. Firstly, it's a good book. It's one of the better books in the series, I think. It's nicely written, nicely paced. The longest book of the main series, by quite a way, I believe, last I checked. But there's obviously a lot of information to put in there. You've got the opening scene, you've got them coming to terms with reality, what's actually happening, which takes probably about half of the book for them all to eventually reach that point of, okay, this is a thing, this is actually happening. Because at the start they were very much, is this just a dream? Have I had a nightmare? Let's just not get involved. Towards the end, it's only really Marco who isn't too keen on it. But we'll get into that a little more in a bit. So, the first note on my board, straight from the start, Jake likes, in italics, likes Cassie. And I've also put somewhere on my list here, where is it? There's already signs of a Rachel Tobias relationship. So, it's been a long time since I read these books, and already we've got two relationships developing, which I think it's very early on actually for the series, for both these relationships to be coming to become apparent. Obviously Marco is left on his own, poor bloke, probably why he's so cynical towards the whole thing. The Jake, Cassie and Rachel Tobias relationships are only hinted at, I think, once. Jake specifically mentions that he likes Tobias, and later on we see Rachel and Tobias, or Tobias on Rachel's shoulder, which Jake obviously sees and points it out because it seems unusual to him. So we're already getting the signs of these little relationships coming up. Now we meet Alfangor, and the book describes him in a way that I didn't expect. It a bit, obviously being a while since I'd read it, I came across this little snippet of description, and I noted it down because of how strange I thought it was. It says, paraphrasing, a head and shoulders with arms, the skin was a pale shade of blue. But below that, he had fur, a mix of blue and tan covering a four-legged body. Now, this seems to be implying that the upper body of the Andalite is hairless. And below that he had fur, a mix of tan covering a four-legged body. So the four-legged section of the Andalite has got fur, but the upper torso doesn't. Which I've never seen depicted or repeated in artwork or further on in the books. But it seems to me that KA's initial imagery of the Andalites was pretty much like the centaur from mythology. You've got like a human upper torso that's hairless and then a hairy lower body. And that's what I think is getting across here. But that was never repeated. Certainly not by the TV series, which made an absolute hash job of the whole Andalite design, let's be honest. So that was something I thought was a bit strange, and something that was probably retconned later on. Very minor retcon. I mean, it's not really relevant at all to the series going ahead, but design element, yeah, a bit different. And I'd never seen that pointed out before. So carrying on from that, Elfangor is describing the Yeerk invasion to the Animorphs. Couple of things I picked up here. Elfangor expects that maybe hundreds of the Yeerks on Earth, which I think is a disastrous underestimation. Absolutely, I mean, it's contradicted pretty much later on in the book. If you get into the Yeerk pool scene or the sharing scene, they're just implied that there are loads of them. So Elfangor was way off in his estimates, or it was just an oversight by the authors. I'm going to go with the former. I think that Elfangor just isn't quite aware of how bad it is at the moment, and it's quick for the animals to figure that out. So Elfangor didn't really help there with the situation, by saying there's maybe, just maybe hundreds. And it's established very, very quickly that it's a much bigger problem. Let's face it, if they didn't have hundreds, how were they going to build what is described in the book as a Yeerk pool that can have stadiums inside it and half a town's worth? It just doesn't seem practicable. So that's another little thing I picked up. The use of the word species. Now, this is one of my little pet peeves in this series and in fan fictions. I've been guilty of it myself. Using the word species when species is strictly a taxonomic name given to something that was arisen from a common ancestor on Earth. So the use of the word species should only count as Earth things. You shouldn't get species of aliens because it would be an alien race. You wouldn't have a species because it doesn't fall under the definition of species. But that's just me being nitpicky and going back to my history of biology. So just forget I even mentioned it, I suppose. Elfangor can show mental images by concentrating. I forget whether this is a major thing going along later in the books, but it's something I might bring up again in the future. It's just a side note here. You can just basically put images into their head and show them things like that, which is not something I remember being used again. I could be wrong. Correct. No, don't correct me. It'll come as a surprise to me as I read the books. I'm just going to take a break at this point just to say, you see what sort of thing I'm doing here. I'm basically writing notes and tackling all these little points that are relevant, while also glossing over the plots of the stories. I mean, you already know the plot on number 1, so there's not that much point in me going over it. You all know it. Right. Something funny I found. They described Yeerks thusly: looks like a snail without its shell. And all I've put on my notes is ... a slug ? Just a funny little thing I picked up. A snail without a shell. You usually just call it a slug, surely. And the idea of the Yeerks taking over thoughts and feelings, which I thought was a bit strange, really. Because the further we go into the book, so we actually, in number 6, we get, spoiler, we get Jake taken over by the Yeerks, and taking over thoughts and feelings kind of makes it seem like you aren't even in your own head, you're just not there at all. Like, all the thoughts and your feelings are taken over as well by this Yeerk creature. But I had a discussion in the Animals Discord, and someone said, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, and it does sort of work, but it's a very vague and very confusing way of looking at it. But again, those are my thoughts and feelings, ironically. Is that irony? I don't know. Anyway, carrying on. Tobias gets touched by Elfanga and receives some kind of shock. Now, we get onto that later on in the book, where Tobias mentions that they have to use Kandronas. Because once the animals are deciding, okay, we're going to do something about this, Tobias mentions they have these Yeerk paws and they have these Kandronas, and that's where we need to attack them, or find where they are. Because Elfanga simply touching Tobias gave him all these jumbled memories. He actually says they're jumbled and I haven't quite made sense of them all yet, which implies that there's more to come. So we'll have to see if that comes to fruition. But that's another power of these Andalites that they're very mysterious at this stage. Very, very mysterious. They have all these sort of superpowers. And I'm not sure how much of that is retconned later on in the series. But that's a subject for another video. I mean, of course, I'll do these reviews. I'll probably do extra little videos in between. And the magic element of these Andalites is something we could probably cover. What sort of abilities do they really have? Another note I picked up, Yeerks apparently have lieutenants, or for you Americans out there, lieutenants. Visser3 specifically mentions the name lieutenant/lieutenant in the book. And now, of course, we have the usual Visser, you have sub-Visser, I believe you have under-Vissers, members of the council. But I don't think the title lieutenant ever appears again in the Animorphs series. Again, maybe another retcon. It's interesting to think how many of these things will be retconned, and I'll probably do a list on those things as well. Another video for the future. Brilliant. I'm hoping you're looking forward to that. So Yeerks have lieutenants/lieutenants. I'm going to stick to the British version and call them lieutenants, because that's what I'm used to. Apologies to you Americans out there. Now, a lot of these ones, I'm looking at this list now, and a lot of them are things that I thought might have been retconned in the future. So Tobias' injury from his cat remained after returning to human form, which is something I'm sure was retconned later on. I'm sure that... I mean, spoiler, later on in the series where they give the ability to morph to disabled kids, and then they're no longer disabled when they morph back. So this is, for a fact, retconned later on. Just another one of those little things. I'll be interested to see when I get the newer version of this book, whether that's still in there. Probably the most obvious thing that was retconned throughout the series, actually. One of the most famous ones is the whole thought speak while you're not in morph thing, which is put on display here by our wonderful Jake. And there's one more thing that I believe was retconned looking at this list. The Hork-Bajir are mentioned as voluntary hosts. Once the Animorphs go down into the Yeerk pool and have a look around, they see all this horror, this madness going on. And they see what they think, or what Tobias presumes, I believe it was Tobias, what he presumes are the voluntary hosts. So they're all sitting around a TV, humans and Hork-Bajir. But we're never really well, firstly, it's just an assumption on their part. So maybe it's not something that's been retconned. It was just a faulty assumption from these naive kids. But we never encounter voluntary Hork-Bajir again. As far as we're concerned, there weren't any. For reasons we could probably delve into as we get to know them more later in the series. So those are the major retcon things. I just thought I'd get them out of the way this early. Plot is, Elfanga is killed. He is basically torn to shreds and eaten by Visser3's monster. And we get our first look at how dark the series can be. I mean, people often say that it gets darker as it goes along this series, but we have seen already in just this one first book quite a lot of dark material. Firstly, obviously, Elfanga getting eaten quite gruesomely. You know, pieces of him falling to the ground and getting gobbled up by Taxons, which are these big, scary centipede-like creatures. We've got this idea that the kids are slowly going to get into grips with the fact that this is a lot more than they bargained for. But they didn't even bargain for it. It was just forced on them. But they're slowly getting this idea that, hold on a minute, this can be anyone. And there's an arc in the book where Marco, rather without empathy, says to Jake, I think your brother's a controller, you know. And Jake's like, no, 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 no. But eventually he gathers little bits of detail as we go through the book. He heard Tom's voice at the construction site. He overheard him at the sharing meeting for the full members. As well as, I think, a couple other little bits. And suddenly he's like, yeah, actually, God damn it, my brother's one of them. And we have a moment in the book where Marco, again, showing very little empathy, which seems to be part of his character at this point. He's very cold and very calculating. He isn't afraid to just say, you're screwed, or you're going to have to do this in the future, which is making his character a bit distinctive at the moment. But we get to this point where Marco says, at some point, you're going to have to, off him. You're going to have to dispose of this person that you love dearly. And at this point in the first book, that is probably the darkest part so far. And to be so early in the book to say, right, you're going to have to kill your own brother because he is lost in his own head. Now that is, for a book of its genre and for its target audience, that's pretty dark stuff. The series counters this with its oft moments of just silliness or kids acting like kids or whatever funny, silly things happening. But there's always this background of sinister, really dark material. And that's not it either. That's book one. Those are only the first couple of things that are incredibly dark. Just the concept of Yeerks controlling your thoughts and feelings. Anyone around you being one of these things. People screaming and crying in cages locked underground in darkness and horror for what they can only assume is the rest of their lives. It's incredibly dark. Incredibly dark. We mentioned Marco's character. The characters overall, I've noted here, the characters are not yet developed. And when I say that, I mean, I know sort of what they're like later on during the war. But we're going to get that in the future. But at the moment, the characters are not quite developed. They still come across as just normal kids. And as you probably know, normal kids of about this age range, they're all practically the same. Apart from the fact that some are lads and some are lasses. They all tend to cluster together into this one mass of child. So that's funny, hard to distinguish between them at this point in time. Obviously, we've been given superficial details, hobbies, things like that. But the character development is something that's going to build. I mentioned Marco's cold and calculating. He's probably been the one with the most development so far. I mean, you could say Tobias, but that's just because on occasion he'll look up mystically, or he'll be happy when he's not usually happy. So relatively superficial stuff. But that is something we will look at going on and something we'll pay close attention to. So they go to a meeting of the sharing because they grow suspicious that it's a front for the Yeerks, and they're correct. They find that out to be correct. But one of the things that irks me, and a lot of people don't like Cassie. Let's be honest, a lot of people do not like Cassie. And I know I'm repeating this, but it's one of those things that we'll cover quite a lot. This was the first example of a very, very silly Cassie manoeuvre, shall we put it. I've put in my notes, why did Cassie go to the sharing meeting on the beach? She got caught. What happened was they sent Jake off to do his doggy thing. And what we find later is Cassie has wandered over, seemingly on her own, and just spied on them as well as herself, and gets caught. Why? She says, I just wanted to check up on him. But surely you can get Tobias to fly over, or get someone else to go in another morph. Why does she entirely just ruin the whole point of the plan is to keep themselves secret and to make sure that no one's seeing them? And she goes over and shows them her. And it was bizarre. And it was because of that we get the new actions when they're just about to go into the Yeerk pool, when they find out that Cassie's been taken by the police officer that saw her at her barn first and then saw her sneaking around at the sharing meeting. So her clumsiness in getting caught there has led to her almost getting taken and the war effort being stopped before it had even gotten started. So that's point number 1 on the naughty Cassie list. So they go down to the Yeerk pool. They're horrified by what they see. And they get, I think it's Marco and Jake that get cornered. I think I'm going to, just as a side note, I'm going to skip over the whole gardens thing. They acquire their animals. They get stuck in a tiger's enclosure, blah, 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 blah. Not particularly interesting, apart from the fact that, I just want to point out, tigers don't really roar, Jake. Lions roar. Tigers, you won't hear much out of them. There's not much point to them roaring. So just keep that in mind, Jake. Keep it in mind, Katherine and Michael. Where was I? Okay, so they're in the Yeerk pool. They get cornered, and Rachel is the first Animorph to list a kill. Now, this is going to be one of the more fun parts of my reviews, I do believe. One of the things I'm going to do is make kill lists or death count lists, but not just for the Animorphs. No. For Visser 3 as well. My experiment is to go through the series and count how many kills the Animorphs register and how many the Visser 3 kills of its own soldiers. So, I've got my list, and we'll put them down as we go through the books. So, and we'll split it into human, Hork-Bajir, Taxxon, Andalite and Yeerk. So how many kills they perform on each of those different races, specifically to ones controlled by Yeerks. So you probably won't get any Andalite ones. But what we want to find is who did more damage to the Yeerk Empire, the Animorphs or Visser 3. Rachel is the first killer of the Animorphs group, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone really. She kills a Taxxon with her elephant morph by repeatedly rolling over it until it's just a pile of goop. Which, okay, Rachel, overkill on first attempt. But let's just have a look at the kill count from this book. The Animorphs, oh, by the way, yeah, it has to be clear kills. It can't be, oh, probably or maybe died. The kill has to be clear, as in there can be no doubt that the Animorphs killed this number of whatever. Same for Visser 3. Visser 3 got the first kill of the overall series, killing Elfangor, who was an Andalite, so he's had one kill in this book. One confirmed kill. The Animorphs have got 3. They have killed 2 Taxxons and 1 human. Funnily enough, Cassie was the killer of the human. Now, it might be controversial, this, but we can be pretty certain that she killed a human at the end, specifically the police officer. Just by the way it's implied, and from the fact that it's never followed up again. Basically, if the policeman was still alive, the information would probably get to the Yeerks that he was arresting this girl and things kicked off. And she would have been rounded up and caught. But it's never mentioned again. She's never chased up for that. So we can assume that when she said that the guy's been dealt with, and she doesn't look happy about it, that she's killed that person. So I'm putting that down as a kill. So the Animorphs in the invasion have killed 1 human and 2 Taxxons, confirmed. They probably did a lot of damage to others, but those are the ones we can confirm at this stage. And Visser 3's killed 1. What else can we see? I'm just going to go through the remaining notes now. Obviously, they get out of the Yeerk pool. Visser 3 kicks off. They manage to free 1 person. They almost freed a bunch of other people. They almost freed Tom. They almost freed a couple of Hork-Bajir as well, which would have been pretty pointless as well, because what would they have done when they got out of the Yeerk pool? These 2 Hork-Bajir standing there. For one thing, we know that they don't like him at this point. I mean, of all the things at the start of the book that Elfangor said to them, they believed everything wholeheartedly that he said. We believe everything he says, but he said that the Hork-Bajir should be pitied. And that's the one thing that Rachel's like, oh yeah, right, sod off. What else do we have? So yeah, they got out. Human, I think, is mentioned in book 2. I think, well, we might get back to that, but they did have one human freed who probably just ran off and was sent to a mental institution pretty soon, or re-Yeerked when she accidentally mentioned it to a controller. That's what we can probably assume. Or she was just assassinated. Well, no, assassinations for the rich and famous. Sorry, murdered. That's the one. Right, so what else have we got on the list? Obviously, Tobias gets stuck in his Hawkmorph, which is right at the end of the book, so we'll probably see the fallout of that in the future couple of books, especially number 3, which is his first narration. Stayed in Morph too long, but there were so many hints going on in this book, so many little bits of foreshadowing that it became... probably the worst part of the book, actually, is how much that's shoved in your face. That's probably the bit I didn't like most about this book. It's basically, this guy's going to get trapped as a hawk, this guy's going to get trapped as a hawk, he's going to get trapped as a hawk. It must have been about 5-6 different occasions where it's like, okay, yeah, get it, it's probably going to happen. And then, of course, it happens really soon, and it's like, well, saw that coming a mile off, really, didn't we? So, yeah, that's the one thing I didn't really like about this first book. That and all the retcon stuff as well, but that can be forgiven. Just a couple of little extras here. The size of the compared to the TV series is something I've noted. One of the worst parts of the TV series, I think, is how small everything seemed. How insignificant the Yeerks seemed. That the Yeerk pool was tiny on its appearance. The camera work made it look so small. And just ineffective. Whereas in the book, it's made to seem like this massive underground lair. Underground city almost, and that's one of the things the book series did so much better than the TV series. It made it seem huge, like this big problem. What else have we got? Just a couple of little corrections I'd like to make to the series. Well, one thing, Jake says that the Anole is part of the iguana family, and then in quotation marks I've put "like you care" because that's what he says. Jake, sorry, I do care because I have a background in herpetology, so I do care. Shut up. Behave yourself. The lizard knowledge in general in the book is quite poor. Anoles don't flick their tongues at all very often to get sense, which is something that the author was trying to get across quite a lot, that he was flicking his tongue out to smell the air. They do have the ability to sense of their tongue, but that's mostly to taste food. So, K.A., Michael, just, I know it's a long time ago and you've probably learnt a bit, but learn your lizards. Do it now. A ladder in a tiger enclosure. Now, I've worked at zoos for a long time. And a ladder in a tiger enclosure is a very, very bad idea. Obviously it's there for plot convenience. You would not have a ladder in a tiger enclosure to get out. That's just... No, you wouldn't. So that's a bit of plot convenience that I didn't like. But I suppose it's understandable. After all, it's only a kid's series. What the hell? So this has been Animorphs number 1, The Invasion, and I've brought up the points that I thought were interesting. Overall, very good book for the series, very important. It's hard to rate a book at this stage because I've got nothing to score it against. I've got no point of comparison. At this point, I'll just say, good book, good way to start a series. It throws those dark themes in there. That's the one thing. Sorry. Not done yet. I just want to point out the naivety of these kids. It seemed to me that, yeah, they thought, oh my god, this is a really big thing, up until the point where they actually start morphing and they get into a battle. It almost seemed to them like it was an action game, up until the point where Jake sees Tom getting hit by the Viscera and kicks off a bit. But until that point, they almost became players of a game in the way they were speaking and what they were doing. And there's just a naivety to it all, which which will change in the future. But at the moment, they're still ignorant to a lot of the stuff that's going on. It's very black and white. This group is evil. We're the good guys. Let's kill them. Let's try to save the people. It's very black and white, very naive. But even though the rest of the book, there's this dark undercurrent of grey area, but they haven't seen that yet, and they're not seeing that yet, which I think is interesting. There's this grey undercurrent, but these two much more in-your-face black and white things, and it's interesting. It's an interesting juxtaposition, really. The authors are putting across something that the characters really cannot see, which is probably my favourite part of the series, the first parts of the series anyway, before that really starts to mix into just one big grey blob. And we'll see that coming. Anyway, this has been the Animorphs YouTube channel talking about number 1, The Invasion, and we will cover all the books so far as I can be bothered, which should happen. Take a while, obviously. Next up, we will discuss number 2, The Visitor. Talk to you soon. Go read the book yourself. Leave comments, subscribe, and check out my other videos. I play all sorts of Animorphs games and stuff like that. So, see you soon. Goodbye.